Okay, we're recording. Now, today we have a really nice topic. We're going to talk about the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus. So I just have set up some explanations here about things that you might be curious about in terms of sort of when and where and how do we know about this stuff. And so we're going to do that for a little while by way of introduction, and then go over some of the fragments of Heraclitus, because I think that Heraclitus is really as much a literary figure in the literary tradition of Europe and whatever other traditions it's a part of, as philosophical. That is, I think that, let me put it another way, I think Heraclitus's literary merit is up there with other Greek sources like Aesop's fables or the tragedians. And so I think that's another way of looking at Heraclitus, in addition to his obvious importance philosophically. So, so let's get on with that. And here we go. And I have here on this title, here we go, Heraclitus, Oracle of the Axial Age. I have a video on the Axial Age in here, meaning around the middle of the first millennium, when we find the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries before the Common Era, about a half a millennium before the time of Christ, that is. And we find across Asia and Europe, not only in these Greek lands, but also in Persia, in India, and in China, a lot of philosophical and cultural, artistic sort of ferment kind of bubbles up. I think nowadays, the beginning of the 21st century, we understand better that these cultures of Asia in the middle of the first millennium had a lot more connections. I mean, we tend to think of them as all being very distant from each other, but I think that it's not some sort of cosmic coincidence that we need Leonard Nimoy to explain to us when we look at what we call the axial age and this sort of renewal of ideas and philosophy that we find around those centuries. I think it's clearly something that reflects general broad evolutionary trends, including, not least of all, the fact that these cultures are communicating with each other. So Heraclitus, by the way, and I'm going to show you a map in a second, lives on the Ionian coast of what today we call Turkey, Asia Minor. And so that's the eastern shores of the Aegean. And so that's where the Silk Road and all the Asian trade routes are coming out into these cities on that coast. And so Heraclitus is among these other Greeks of that time, talking about the late 500s, early 400s, late 6th century, early 5th century BCE. And he is definitely exposed to all kinds of ideas coming from India and China. And also a lot of scholarship today is actually exploring the other possibility that it was a Greek influence that we can actually find in, for example, Hindu and Buddhist traditions of thought. So that's an interesting area of scholarship that's happening now. So I say Heraclitus, Oracle of the Axial Age. Heraclitus, very, I think, representative, a real avatar of this axial age. And he's right at the right time. He's flourishing right about the year 500 BC, right in the very middle of the first millennium, the beginning of the century of Imperial Athens. So, as I say, we say flourished around 400 BC. We call them the Presocratics. That is simply meaning that these are the Greek philosophers who lived before Socrates and Plato. Remember also that the word philosophy here is not a very specific or specialized word the way that it is in modern language. The word philosophy here is a very broad term that means anyone who's interested in producing knowledge. Most of the people who would be called philosophers in the middle of the first millennium are people that today we would call scientists, doing what today, that is, we would call science, sort of investigating nature in various ways, as well as, you know, any other sort of knowledge producing technique you could think of. I mean, philosophy, again, very broad term there. course, these people didn't know they were the pre-Socratics, just like Plato and Aristotle didn't know they were Plato and Aristotle. These are terms that we impose on them from our perch in the future. It is important to know that Heraclitus, though, does come from Ionia, which is an interesting place. It's where we get the idea of Ionic as one of the column styles. One of the things about studying the art and architecture of ancient Greece and Rome, you have to learn your columns. So the Milesians, and we will have a video on the Milesians, that would be Anaxagoras, Thales, Anaxagoras, and Anaximenes, and perhaps dealing with Xenophanes a little bit, the poet there as well. Sort of canonized by Aristotle as the earliest philosophers. And these Ionian Milesians are naturalists. They are doing what we would call physics. They have cosmologies. Heraclitus is also an Ionian naturalist, recognizably so. His doctrines of the unity and flow of opposites are very similar to the physical system that we get from Anaxagoras, for example. So he's not, we don't want to fetishize Heraclitus and say that he's some sort of unique sort of person coming up from nowhere. Heraclitus is very much in the main line of this sort of discussion of whether or not the cosmos is an ordered place. That's one of the big issues here. And the foundation of sort of the most important kinds of knowledge is another thing that they're wondering about, as we will get into. It was also, as the Chinese would say, an interesting place. That is, it was under a distant Persian rule by the liberal Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great. Locally, he lived north of Heraclitus, lived in Ephesus, a city north of Miletus on the coast, which Ephesus was in Lydia. And the Lydians are non-Greek people. So the Lydians are really the main cultural influence in this area, which is in a larger sense under Persian rule. And the Lydians are more magical, more sort of old school, more what you would then call Oriental in the jargon of the art history of the time, I guess. And so some of that sort of oracular, sort of spooky feel that Heraclitus has, I think, comes from this kind of Lydian influence. But anyways, that's all I'll say about that stuff, but it's really interesting stuff. It's a really interesting place and time. So it's learning about the historical background of the Greek philosophers, I think, is really key. That's one thing I've discovered studying Greek philosophy for a long time. So you see on the right hand there, the Persian Empire, and there's Lydia and Ionia, Ephesus, I guess one of those lines of the marches, the soldiers, and Miletus. Miletus, where the other philosophers, Greek-speaking philosophers, were working, was really there was a revolt, and the Persians put together a massively huge army that marched into Miletus. So all these people didn't live in peaceful times at all. Now, another question that people have is about the fragments and what's meant by fragments. Archaeologists who are dealing with ceramics might talk about shards. So a shard then of a piece of pottery, or a lintel, a piece of stone or something like that, an actual physical object. A fragment is not a physical object. A fragment is a textual object, is a linguistic object. What a fragment is a phrase, a sentence. It could be as long as a number of sentences, or it could just be a small fragment of a couple of words. So what happens is you're reading along, say you're reading along in Aristotle, and then you read, and Aristotle says something like, but as Heraclitus would say, the way up and the way down is one and the same. And so there you've got a quotation that is presented as an actual quotation. Or you might be reading some other source, and they might say, the ways up and ways down are actually similar things, as the ancient sage told us. So it's a paraphrase, and it's not an exact quotation. Nonetheless, it does confirm, the reading. So this is called textual collation in philology, which is the study of ancient texts. Of course, obviously, you have to know your ancient, you have to know your ancient Greek. There are different kinds of ancient Greek. You have to know your Attic Greek, and you have to know a lot of other stuff. I can't do that because obviously you have to devote your whole life to be able to do that. I very much salute people who do. Um, and then I also would mention, for example, the refutation of all heresies is something you run into references to it again and again, because this guy, Hippolytus, was this Christian guy in the Roman Empire who wanted to refute all the pagans. And so he was really a dutiful scholar and writer. And so what he does is he gives us all kinds of quotations from all these pagans, including Heraclitus, who was trying to refute. But one of the reasons why we know about, I don't know, maybe half a dozen or more of Heraclitus's fragments is because of Hippolytus. So yeah, he's a good scholar. I salute him too. The Temple of Artemis in Ephesus was a very grand place. It wasn't a small little temple by the side of the road. It was considered one of the seven wonders of the world. It looks like it's Parthenon style building. When you also can't help but be reminded of Washington D.C. Classical architecture, because it is where Jefferson's getting it from, and the rest of them. It was a huge place, and Heraclitus is not just any hermit sort of person. Heraclitus is a member of an elite royal family, land titled family of Ephesus. The story is that he was the hereditary leader of some rites in the Temple of Artemis, but he gave that over to his brother. He chose not to do that. So he had a book. Now, another thing about these titles of books, in the ancient world, these scrolls, and there was a lively trade in them, and there were these what are the equivalent of what we would call bookstores, and there were intellectual people who frequented these places, and so there was a lot of interaction. These people weren't all just sort of writing in a vacuum somewhere up on a mountain, not knowing about anybody else. A lot of these people are city folks, and they're really into all these conversations. Um, but they'll all, it's really more like who is it by. They didn't really care about the titles. So the real titles they would have would be things like on nature, on virtue, on the cosmos, on ethics, on the gods. I mean, all the titles are like that, because they just didn't really have a convention of sort of making up a unique title for a book like that. So he had a book called On Nature, and you see it when you're reading books about Heraclitus, or you're looking at editions of translations of the fragments of Heraclitus. They'll always be grouped by some fairly obvious groupings. I'm not disputing that these groups exist. Human nature, paradox, the soul, the unity of opposites, logos. We'll talk about that. But I want to address that issue about what the various topics are in a moment. And the last bullet point there is the other thing about Heraclitus is he was very well known. Heraclitus was quite famous, and we have people reading his book clearly with their own copies of his book and talking about that in writings from Roman periods many hundreds of years later. And certainly in the Greek-speaking world, 200, 300 years after Heraclitus, he was very well known. Not that big of a world, obviously, in some ways. I really want to stress this. I want to talk about Heraclitus as a writer and Heraclitus's expectations on the reader. Because I think if we don't understand that, we can't understand, it's much harder to read him in the right sort of way. First of all, he's writing aphorisms. What are aphorisms? They are short sayings. In Heraclitus, these will be things like the way up and the way down are one and the same, or donkeys prefer straw to gold, that kind of thing. And so these are short sayings that are ideally designed to make the reader think and to have sort of nuggets of wisdom in them, to say a lot in a small amount. And when they're charismatic and memorable, like Heraclitus's aphorisms, they have legs, they last, people keep repeating them. And many famous sayings, I think, that sometimes get attributed to other people, such as you can't step twice into the same river, for example, actually come from Heraclitus. Heraclitus himself really he's a misanthropic person. He obviously doesn't think much of people in general. He's not shy about that. And so that's, I think, part of his attitude, that he wants to right? He was called the Riddler. He was called Heraclitus the Obscure, Heraclitus the Dark in his own time, because his reputation was that he wrote these riddles and mysterious things that it was difficult to understand. And he was doing that on purpose because, third bullet point, another thing that these Greek writers have in common with Asian writers is that the fancy word is soteriological, comes from religious studies. It's a big mouthful of a word, I know, but it's actually a pretty good word to know. It means that the purpose of the teachings are to transform you and make you better. So you're not just sort of reading information because you're a scholar studying along. You're actually, then the idea is that the reader is reading this for self-improvement, quite literally. That is, this is supposed to help transform you, as again with lots of religious texts. And Heraclitus is that kind of writer. So it's the essence of the thing that you do the exercise. And then last bullet point, again, I can't do this stuff because I don't have these technical skills, but this is thanks to the entry on Heraclitus from the Stanford Online Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which I will always make a point of reading their entry on just about any philosophical matter. I strongly recommend that you do as well, and donate to them too, because as I have, because they need support. So having mentioned that, then let me show you this. Moroi, mesones, mesonas, moiras, lanchanusi. I don't know anything about pronunciation, but notice he's using alliteration there. That is, there are several different Greek words that start with the same sound. And so he's creating a sonorous alliterative aphorism there. The way he says greater deaths bring greater destinies, whatever that means. And then a man's character is his destiny, or just character is destiny. Maybe one of the most famous, because obviously one of the most universal sort of aphorisms that we find Heraclitus coining, ethos anthropoi daemon. The daemon is the spirit. It's the energy of the spirit. We're going to talk about what soul means here. So the ethos, the character, anthropoi of the man, the spirit of the man is what the man's ethos is. Anthos. So somebody who is actually, I'm told by the people who can read this, and brilliant people like the scholar Charles Kahn, that he is a great wordsmith this way. All right, moving on. Another really important thing here that I think often gets in the way of people reading the Presocratics and reading ancient Greek in general, I think this is true of reading Plato as well, is that we tend to compartmentalize topics. We think sometimes people are doing psychology, and sometimes people are doing physics, and sometimes people are doing cosmology and talking about the beginning of the world, and sometimes people are talking about the way that people live together and get along with each other. And these are all different topics, and so we can sort all that out. But I want to challenge that a little. I want to call that out a little. I think for all, as I say, for all ancient Greek writers, I think they don't separate ethics, psychology, and physics and cosmology, those four topics. They think it's clear. I think they find it transparent that all of those topics are impinging on each other, and that it's sort of all one. So, so particularly, I think for understanding their psychology, I think you have to then, for one thing, you just have to understand their physics and cosmology, but you also have to appreciate the fact that they see those two things as looking at the same two things in different ways, the same thing in different ways. I think I mentioned further on here, remember, these are people who also haven't internalized any Cartesian mind-body dualist, early modern ideas like that, which is another, just as in studying Asian philosophy, so in studying ancient Greek philosophy, that's something that's important to keep in mind. So that's the second bullet point then. Listening not to me, but to the Logos, it's wise to remember that all things are one. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this notion of trying to produce knowledge by talking about the oneness of things rather than the difference between things. So now another thing is, of course, there's Heraclitus, and there are the Heraclitean fragments that we have. And there's also sort of Heraclitus, the character, in our sort of story of philosophy, the narrative of philosophy. And one way you get Plato set up is that Plato, according to the story, somewhat expressed by Plato himself, who apparently was verily quite invested in Heraclitus as a young man, and has something of the character of the apostate in his attitudes towards Heraclitus, I think. But the story is that Heraclitus says that everything's constantly changing. And so since everything's constantly changing, then you can't ever actually have a fixed description of the world. And so notice it's a physical claim. We could call it a metaphysical claim. You know, we could call it either one of those things, metaphysical or physical. The claim that Heraclitus's claim that the material world is constantly changing, it's constantly flowing on, constantly coming to be and passing away, just as we were taught in the contemporary Indian tradition at that time. This is part of the teaching. But then if that's true, I mean, if that metaphysical point then has an epistemological implication. Metaphysics about what things exist and what the things that exist are like. Epistemology about knowledge and about what can be known, sort of two parts of philosophy. So you have a metaphysical or physical view that all of matter is constantly changing and flowing on, and this presents an epistemological problem. In Plato's dialogue, the Theaetetus, the way this is expressed is that it's like shooting after a flying game, right? So you flushed the birds, the grouse out of the bush, and they're flying across the sky, and you're going to try and shoot them with your bow and arrow, I guess, if you're, but anyway. Because they're constantly changing location, they're not in the same place. So again, what's the epistemological problem? Then it looks like a knowledge that's going to be true in all times and places is not possible. It looks like any knowledge that you have is going to be indexed to some kind of time and place, because everything's constantly changing. Nothing ever stays the same. So that's the epistemological problem. If the material world is constantly changing, then how can we produce propositions about the world that are going to be universally applicable, that are going to be true in all times and places? And the answer to that is going to be another metaphysical answer for Plato. That is because Plato does metaphysics. And so, what Plato's going to say is, well, you've got to find the existing thing that is the same in all times and places and doesn't come to be and pass away. And that's the thing about which you can have knowledge that has those properties as well. So Parmenides, and I have another video of Parmenides on this series. It's too much to get into right now, but Parmenides gives us very interesting arguments to the effect, logical arguments to the effect that it must be that ultimate reality is an unchanging, propertyless unity. You know, like I say, same bad time, same bad channel. Check out the Parmenides video for that one. But Plato is intrigued by this, and so Plato then sets himself up in a way as between Heraclitus and Parmenides. Heraclitus, everything's constantly changing. Parmenides, ultimate reality is a oneness, and Plato looking for that Parmenidean object, right? That Parmenidean reality that could be the object of Platonic knowledge. And of course, what he finds is mathematics. That's the punchline. But let's move on with Heraclitus. I mentioned that that's Plato's Heraclitus, or that's the Heraclitus that we often encounter in our sort of pedagogic narrative of Plato and what's motivating him. But there's a problem there, and that is that Heraclitus makes, I think, a pretty unique use of this Greek word logos, which typically is used in the way that we see it around in our own language today, the logo of a company. the logos, the sign or the symbol or the word or the name of a thing, is usually the sense of logos in the Greek of Heraclitus's own time. But Heraclitus uses logos in um, an unusual way. And he talks about the divine logos as the kind of energy that steers all things. Thunderbolt steers all things. So I think, and I think this is true in Plato too, thought, you notice, it is always moving forward. And thought seems to be part of sort of this animating spirit of humans. There isn't a sorting out here of the concept of life, of being something that's alive, and soul or mind being something that's having experiences. Um, Again, there isn't that sort of Cartesian overlay on all of that. So, so there's a sense then that the logos steers all things. Each man acts as if he lives in a world of his own, but he's ignorant. He doesn't realize that everything is one with the logos steering all things. You know, these are the teachings. So, and remember, he does not have that. This is very important. It's the third bullet point on the slide here. He does not have that distinction between the mental and the physical, between the inner and the outer. He's talking about the way that the universe is. So last bullet point is not as substantial. It's just that the Pythagoreans, for example, at that time were a force. They were around long after Pythagoras, who was a showman himself, was gone. And there are also these followers of Heraclitus, who's a misanthropic character like Nietzsche, who probably wouldn't have approved of having followers like that. And so, for example, in some of Plato's writings, when he mentions Heraclitus, he actually is talking about the followers of Heraclitus. So as you have these little arrows, these little paradoxical arrows in their quill that they shoot at you. Okay. So anyway, what's the point of all that? That we can't actually equate Heraclitus with just sort of nothing, with randomness. It doesn't look like Heraclitus supports what a lot of materialists would insist was a necessary part of materialism, which would be that there were sort of random factors driving change. Finally, and then we'll look at some of Heraclitus's fragments for a minute or two. But Heraclitus appears to violate the law of non-contradiction because Heraclitus says that opposites are one. He says up is down and down is up, and hot is cold and cold is hot. He says death is life and life is death. He has pairs of opposites that look like they make sense, and he has pairs of opposites that look like they don't. Well, one thing that Heraclitus is doing in terms of doing physics is he's trying to understand how it is that energy gets into the physical system. And so the ones that are coherent, the opposites that are coherent unities, are these ones which are actually not essentially opposites, but which are both different points on the same range. So then temperature, for example. So you have hot and cold, but which you don't have two different things, hot and cold. What you just have is one thing, which is temperature. And so the idea then is that what you see is that doesn't stay the same because the temperature is always sort of moving towards its opposite, which isn't a bad empirical observation. I mean, heated things will cool off. The things that are cold will rise to room temperature and further with heat. And Aristotle, who I think understood talk of Parmenidean and sort of Taoist talk about the unity of things, he talks about this in the Physics. He just didn't think that it was what he did. Aristotle, he said, maybe that's interesting to think about, but for me, everything is what it is and not another thing, and that's how I produce knowledge. And Aristotle spent most of his time out in tidal pools doing biology, really, with Theophrastus. But Parmenides and a lot of Asian teaching teaches us that from the teaching that everything is one, that everything is a unity, we can produce knowledge. I think it's a perfectly legitimate question to ask, well, how do you produce knowledge that way? Aristotle said, I just don't think you can produce the kind of knowledge that I want. So I'm just not interested in that. Um, but uh, um, but Heraclitus and Parmenides, see, the thing is, it's like the integer, right? You have to have the number one, and then the number one leads to all the other numbers. But anyway, that's, you might look at maybe the Taoist video for that. All right, so anyway, just to end up here, um, I don't know. I didn't try to pick out the most sort of mind-blowingly cool fragments. I just kind of, actually I was looking at a little more systematic things. So first of all, the first three there: seekers of gold dig up much earth and find little. Donkeys would prefer straw to gold. Okay, so what you have there, it looks like an example of perspectival relativism. Perspectival relativism, which is the sophistical position of people like Protagoras, who says that man is the measure of all things. Um, it's this sophistic conclusion about value, that value is a matter of individual perspective, situational, is something that Plato opposes. Um, but if cosmologically you think that the universe is this process of this cyclical process of coming to be and passing away, um, and it itself is an amoral process, then what follows from that, the sophistical teaching, the teaching of the sophists like Protagoras and Gorgias, is that, well, then human beings need to produce their own political cultures. And I think that Plato's looking for another alternative to that in Republic, where he's trying to found human cultures in some kind of higher sort of law. But it looks like Heraclitus is taking that sophistical position when he says, hold fast to your laws, you would hold your city wall. Because that's the only thing that keeps, because human convention is the only thing that protects humans from the chaos of the universe, of true nature. And so you see also there that cosmology and physics is deeply interconnected with any kind of discussion of value and ethics and psychology for the Greeks. And that's just, it's not understanding them not to see that. You will not find the limits of the soul so deep as its measure. There's a nice one. Think about meditation. And so if in meditation I mean, I don't know if Heraclitus is thinking this, I'm just thinking this. Because, oh, by the way, we're discussing Heraclitus' fragments. So now, I've been teaching ancient Greek philosophy in the classroom to undergraduates for a really long time. And with Heraclitus, well, it used to be photocopied them. Now we just have them up on the computer, and you say, okay, everybody, go find some of these fragments that you thought were interesting. You have something to say, and next class, we'll have a discussion about them. And Heraclitus is a wonderful discussion generator. So I recommend that if you are a teacher and you're getting to Heraclitus, give everybody the fragments and ask all the people in your class to read the fragments and find ones that got them thinking, and then have them come and tell everybody else how they got thinking. And people will really get into that. Like I say, I've been doing it for years. So let's discuss some fragments. To me, if I'm going to do a video on Heraclitus, we're going to discuss the fragments. So you'll not find the limits of the soul so deep as its measure. Your thoughts and feelings are happening in a void. And remember, there's no distinction between the inner and the outer. This fire, the same for all, is not made by God or man, but forever is and will be an everlasting fire going out and rekindling in equal measure. So, I mean, there you go. It's a basic, as I say, it's very much like Anaxagoras. It's a cyclical cosmology of the universe going through a cycle of sort of organization and disintegration. Empedocles, everybody thinks this. Cold warms up, warm cools, moist dries, dry dampens. Look, you can take it as an empirical claim. Remember, these are fragments from Heraclitus. Anything cold is going to warm up. Anything warm is going to cool down um, sooner or later. And so it just looks like that's how things go. And again, what's Heraclitus doing? He's trying to identify how it is that the energy is coming into the system and what the energy consists of. Other thinkers in later times didn't miss that this is all very dialectical. If you want to see some really wacko um, translations of Heraclitus's fragments, check out Hegel. He's really, um, and then these last two I just like, because they're just so much Heraclitus. What I like about them: a fool is a flutter at every word. Um, let's just be snotty Heracliteans about it. A fool is a flutter at every word, because they're not keeping up with what you're thinking, and they're not empowering themselves to draw their own conclusions, and so they don't understand what you're saying, and they don't know how to react to what you're saying, and so they're not a very good conversationalist to hang out with, since everything you say they go, what? Also, you use words that they don't know, not necessarily because they're big words, but just words from another region, but they can't handle it. More so, though, more misanthropic, is dogs bark at what they don't know. What do I need to know about that stuff for? Nah, I don't need to know about that. What do I need to know about chemistry for? Oh, yeah. Dogs bark at what they don't know. It's just a defensive mechanism. That's what a dog does. Dog doesn't want to know things. Dog is afraid of learning because he's just a conservative being who just wants you to go away. And he likes to keep thinking that he's proud of himself. Okay, just a couple more. In the circle, the beginning and the end are common. That's like, I put that one in there always because that's like the most perfect aphorism I've ever seen. In the circle, the beginning and the end are common. It means so many different things. It's so simple. And it takes you, it moves, The way up and the way down are one and the same. Souls love to become moist, but the driest soul is purest and best. And this is Plato. Actually, this time around, looking at Heraclitus and Plato, I see all these similarities between Heraclitus and Plato, really. Souls love to become moist. The existentialists say something like this, don't they? I'd rather sort of sink back down into the mud of being. I'd rather just be thingy. I'd rather just sort of lose myself in thinginess. I'd rather not think. I'd rather just give my freedom away. I'd rather just be a couch potato. I want to just get muddy. But the driest soul is purest and best if I purify myself. And the Pythagoreans, by the way, who thought that the universe was sort of made out of numbers somehow, they used to go, their votive activities at the temple were doing logic proofs and geometry proofs, at which point I tell you that, you go, whew, boy, that was wild. But you know what they used to do at Plato's Academy for hundreds of years, what his students also used to do a lot? You guessed it. I mean, what they would do would be to do geometry and logic. And why? And math. Why? Because it's cleansing the soul. It's purifying the soul. It's a sacramental activity. Character is destiny. Again, really perfect aphorism. The fairest order in the world is nothing but a heap of dust. And again, this is the thing that Plato doesn't like, and that Plato doesn't want to accept, that the fairest order in the world is nothing but a heap of dust. And I think it is a issue for materialists. I think materialists have to deal with this question about the order of the world. And whether admitting that there is some kind of order in the world. And by the way, this issue about whether random interactions could lead through iterations to the emergence of order from chaos is interesting, but doesn't actually get at all the philosophical issues here. That is to say, whether or not there is order. Plato sort of thinks the whole universe is an intentional being. I don't think that's conceptually coherent myself, but I think that looks like what he thinks. So anyway, Heraclitus. I don't think that's the last thing. Oh, right. So Michelangelo, just about 1,000, let's see, 1,000, just about 2,000 years later, Is that right? Yeah, just about 2,000 years later, Michelangelo painted the Delphic Sibyl, the Sibyl with raving mouth, uh, rants, but speaks over 1,000 years because of the God in her. And so Michelangelo painted the Delphic Sibyl, who we know from Heraclitus, into his Sistine Chapel ceiling. It's one of these many figures that fill in all these little spandrels on the architecture of the ceiling. And so Raphael saw Michelangelo's painting of the Sistine Chapel, and he loved the way that Michelangelo was sort of doing blocky human figures on the ceiling, knowing Michelangelo was probably doing it so it would look better from the below or something. And so when Raphael saw that, he went and painted into his already in progress painting school of Athens, Michelangelo as Heraclitus, using the sort of blocky style that he was admiring Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel that same year. So that's sort of, yeah, so that's sort of the history of a little art history there about Heraclitus, I guess. There we go. So Heraclitus, a very wonderful pre-Socratic ancient Greek philosopher, someone very good to know about because you can have your own relationship with him. There's 124 fragments. You can very easily read them. And so quite apart from his influence on other things or, sort of all the rest of that, there's also the pleasure of looking at these fragments and thinking about what they mean. And I do encourage you to do that. So, all right. Bye-bye. Oh, let's stop the share. Okay, stop the share. And now we will end the film or whatever. I guess this is a film, is it?